Somewhere in the green dark of what is now northern Guatemala, there is a slab of pale limestone with a sentence carved into it that no one ever finished. You can still see where the work stopped. The first glyphs are deep, confident, beautiful, the loops and dots and tiny carved faces of a writing system more sophisticated than anything else in the ancient Americas. And then, partway across the stone, the lines grow shallower, hesitant. The last mark is barely a scratch, as if the hand holding the chisel had simply lifted away mid-stroke and never come back down. We will never know what that sentence was going to say. We don't know the name of the person carving it. We don't know whether they meant to return the next morning or whether they already understood, somewhere behind the eyes, that there would be no next morning in this place, that the city around them was dying, and that they were carving the final words of a civilization without realizing it. But here's the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up. This was not one unfinished carving in one unlucky city. Across an area the size of a country, across the rainforests and limestone plains of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, the carving stopped almost everywhere, within the space of about 100 years. The dates these people had been recording for nearly 7 centuries, in an unbroken chain stretching back generation upon generation, simply ended. One city's last date, then another's, like lamps going dark across a valley at the end of the world. And then there was silence, a silence that would last more than 1,000 years. These were not primitive people. I need you to understand that before we go any further, because everything that follows depends on it. The people who set down that chisel had inherited a civilization that had mapped the movements of the planet Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for another 700 years. They had a written language so complete it could record poetry, prophecy, royal gossip, and the precise hour of a king's birth. They had invented the concept of zero, a leap of pure abstraction that much of the so-called Old World had not yet managed. They had raised pyramids taller than anything that would stand in their hemisphere until the steel skyscrapers of the 20th century. And then they walked away from all of it. Not in a single night. Not in flames, not under a conquering army, not beneath a meteor falling from a clear sky. There was no single villain. That is the thing that has haunted every explorer, every archaeologist, every quiet person who has ever stood in one of those abandoned plazas and felt the strangeness of it pressing on their chest. The Maya did not die in their cities. For the most part, their bones are not piled in the streets. The great plazas were not buried under ash. They were simply, eventually, left. Picture it. A plaza the size of several football fields, paved in white plaster so bright it would have hurt your eyes at noon. Around it, temples climbing into the sky on staircases steep enough to make your stomach drop. Painted in red and blue and green. Crowded, for centuries, with tens of thousands of people. Kings in jade and the feathers of birds that no longer exist. Priests, traders, farmers, children, drummers, the sick and the powerful and the ordinary. A city more populous, in its day, than London, than Paris. And then imagine standing in that same plaza, in the same spot, 300 years later. The plaster has cracked. Grass has pushed up through the seams. The painted temples have faded to the gray of old bone, and from their summits, small trees have begun to grow, their roots reaching down into the stone like slow fingers. There is no one. There has been no one for longer than anyone can remember. The only sound is the wind and the calls of howler monkeys, which from a distance sound unsettlingly like human voices crying out somewhere just beyond the trees. The jungle has come back. It always comes back. And it is patient in a way that no human kingdom has ever been. That is the image at the center of this story. A great civilization, at the height of its genius, simply being swallowed by the green. And the question that the image forces on you, the question that will pull at you for the next 2 hours, the way it has pulled at scholars for 2 centuries, is brutally simple. What happened here? What could possibly empty 100 cities? What could make 250,000 people in some regions abandon the homes their families had lived in for 30 generations? What could break a civilization that had survived earthquakes and droughts and wars for over 1,000 years? Break it so thoroughly that when European ships finally arrived, the conquerors sailed right past these ruins and assumed they had been built by some other, vanished race, because they could not believe that the people they were meeting, the people farming in the shadow of those pyramids, had ever built anything so magnificent? Hold on to that last detail. It matters more than you can yet know. Because one of the cruelest twists in this entire story is hiding inside it. A twist that has shaped the way the whole world has misunderstood the Maya for 500 years. We will come back to it. I promise you. But not yet. For now, I only want you to feel the weight of the mystery. To sit, for a moment, in that abandoned plaza, with the howler monkeys crying in the dark and the roots cracking the temples open 1 millimeter at a time, and to ask the question that this whole journey is built to answer. Not just how a civilization falls, but how a civilization can fall so completely that it forgets it was ever great. How the descendants of god kings can end up tending corn in the ruins of their ancestors' palaces, unable to read the writing on the walls around them. How the most accomplished people of an entire hemisphere can vanish from history's stage so quietly that, for centuries afterward, the rest of the world will simply assume they were never there at all. To understand how they left, we first have to understand what they had, and how completely, how utterly, how fatally they believed in it. Because they did not think they were fragile. No one ever does. The people in that bright plaster plaza, in the years before the cracks appeared, believed they were living in a world that had been built to last forever. They believed their kings could speak to the gods. They believed the rain would always come when it was called. They believed that the order of the universe ran through their cities like blood through a body, and that as long as the rituals were performed, and the temples were raised, and the calendar was kept, the sun would rise, the corn would grow, and the world would go on exactly as it always had. They were wrong about almost all of it. But to see how wrong, to feel the full distance of the fall, you have to first climb with them to the very top. You have to see the world the way they saw it, in the centuries when everything was still rising, when the future looked endless, and when no one carving those confident, beautiful glyphs into the stone could have imagined a day when the carving would stop. So let us go back, past the silence, past the empty plazas and the patient jungle. Back to the beginning, when the first of these cities was nothing but a few huts beside a swamp, and a handful of people looked at the impossible green wilderness around them and decided, against all reason, to build something that would touch the sky. To understand why the fall of the Maya is so haunting, you first have to understand how unlikely their rise was in the first place. Because the place they chose to build their world was, by almost any sensible measure, one of the worst places on Earth to build a civilization. We tend to imagine great ancient empires growing up beside great rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, wide, generous waters that flood once a year, lay down rich black soil, and carry boats and grain and armies up and down their length. That is the easy way to build a civilization. You let the river do half the work. The Maya heartland had no such river. The central lowlands where their greatest cities would rise are a vast shelf of porous limestone, and limestone does something cruel with water. It drinks it. Rain that falls on the Maya world does not pool into helpful rivers and lakes. It sinks. It vanishes downward through the rock into hidden caverns and underground streams, leaving the surface, for much of the year, bone dry. There is a wet season and a dry season, and in the dry season the land can crack and the streams can disappear, and there is no friendly river to fall back on. So think about what this means. To live here at all, to feed a single village, let alone a city of 100,000, these people had to solve the problem of water themselves. They had to outwit the very ground they stood on. And they did. They became, in a sense that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate, one of the most sophisticated hydraulic civilizations in human history. They carved enormous reservoirs into the bedrock and lined them with clay and stone, so the precious rainwater would not simply drain away. They sculpted entire cities so that every plaza, every staircase, every paved surface sloped, almost invisibly, toward these reservoirs, so that when the rains came, the city itself became a vast machine for catching water, channeling it down through canals and filters into great hidden tanks that could carry a population through the long dry months. They planted forests of fruit and useful trees they could harvest. They terraced hillsides and drained swamps and turned wetlands into raised gardens of astonishing fertility. They did not find a paradise, they built one, out of a rainforest that wanted nothing more than to swallow them. And the fact that they could do it at all should tell you something about the kind of minds we are dealing with. Because the water was only the beginning. Look up on a clear night in the Maya world, and you will see something that the glow of our modern cities has stolen from most of us. A sky so thick with stars it looks almost solid. A river of light spilling from horizon to horizon. The Maya looked up at that sky for centuries, and they did not just admire it. They read it. They tracked it. They wrote it down. They noticed that one particular bright point of light, the planet we call Venus, appeared and disappeared in a rhythm of its own, a cycle of mornings and evenings that took just over a year and a half to complete. And they measured that cycle, generation after generation, refining it, correcting it, until they could predict the movements of Venus across the sky with an error of less than 2 hours over the span of 5 centuries. Let me say that again so it lands. 500 years of prediction, accurate to within a couple of hours. They did this without telescopes, without clocks, without a single piece of glass ground into a lens. They did it with patience, with stone observatories aligned to the horizon, and with mathematics that they invented from scratch. And what mathematics it was! Most of the ancient world counted in clumsy ways, with cumbersome symbols and no easy method for handling truly enormous numbers. The Maya built a counting system using just 3 marks, a dot, a bar, and a shell-shaped symbol. And that shell symbol represented something that almost no other civilization on Earth had grasped. It represented 0, nothing, the absence of quantity, treated as a quantity in its own right. It is difficult to overstate what an intellectual leap this is. 0 is not obvious. 0 is one of the most profound abstractions the human mind has ever produced, and it had to be discovered, independently, only a handful of times in all of history. The Maya were one of those handful, and they used it to do something that reveals, more than anything else, what truly obsessed them. They used it to count time. Time was the Maya obsession. Time was, in a very real sense, their religion. While other civilizations measured time loosely, a king's reign, a harvest, a generation, the Maya built a calendar of staggering precision and reach. They threaded together cycles within cycles, a sacred round of 260 days, a solar count of 365, and beyond those, a vast machine of days they called the long count, capable of naming any single day across thousands of years without ambiguity, the way we might write out a date down to the exact second. They began counting from a fixed point in the deep past, a mythic moment of creation that, in our calendar, falls in the year 3114 before the Common Era. And from that anchor, they counted forward, day after day after day, recording the result on their monuments. Every great stone slab a king raised, every temple he dedicated, was stamped with the exact date in this long count. They were, in effect, writing the precise coordinates of their present moment into stone, so that anyone, anywhere, at any point in the future, could know exactly when they had stood there. Think about the mind behind that. To carve the date so carefully is to believe, deep in your bones, that the future will care, that there will be a future, that someone, centuries from now, will read your stone and know your name and your God and the precise day the world watched you become king. It is an act of breathtaking confidence. It is a civilization speaking directly to eternity, certain that eternity is listening. Remember that confidence. We are going to watch it die. And the writing itself, the writing was the crown of all of it. Across the entire span of the pre-Columbian Americas, from the tip of South America to the edge of the Arctic, the Maya were the only people to develop a fully written language. Not pictures, not symbols that hint at meaning, a true script capable of recording the sounds of speech that could write down anything a person could say. Names, dates, conquests, marriages, prayers, insults, the words God supposedly spoke. They wrote on stone, on pottery, on the plastered walls of buildings, and on long, folding books made of bark paper coated in white lime, painted in brilliant colors, and read like a screen unfolding across a table. Imagine the scribes. We don't know most of their names, but we know they existed because we can see their handwriting, some confident, some shaky, some clearly the work of a master, and others the work of a student still learning the impossible craft. Imagine a young one, sitting cross-legged in the cool shade of a palace room, a brush of animal hair in hand, copying out a calendar, a history, a prophecy. He has trained for years. He can read the sky. He belongs to a tiny, lettered elite in a world where almost no one else can read a single glyph, and that knowledge makes him powerful and proud and certain that his books will outlast him by 1,000 years. He is wrong about that too. Almost every book the Maya ever made will be deliberately destroyed. Out of the thousands upon thousands of these painted bark paper books, only 4 will survive into our time. 4. The rest will burn. But that is a horror for a later chapter, and the scribe in his cool palace room cannot imagine it, any more than he can imagine the fire, or the men who will set it, or the centuries of silence that will follow. For now, his world is intact, and at the very top of that world, above the scribes and the astronomers and the engineers who tame the water, stood a single figure who held the whole thing together, or who was believed to: the king. But the Maya king was not a king the way we usually mean it. He was not merely a ruler, a general, a tax collector with a crown. He was something far stranger and far more fragile. His title in their language meant something close to Holy Lord. He was understood to be the living hinge between the human world and the world of the gods and the ancestors, a kind of door through which the sacred could pass into the everyday. The rains, the harvests, the victories in war, the very turning of the calendar, all of it was believed to depend, in part, on him, on his rituals, on his bloodline, on his body, and on his blood, quite literally. To keep the cosmic order running, the king was expected to bleed, to open his own flesh in elaborate, agonizing rituals, to pull a barbed cord through his tongue, to pierce parts of the body I will leave to your imagination, and to offer that blood, in the rising smoke and the swimming pain, to the gods who needed it. The pain was the point. The suffering of the Holy Lord was understood to be the price of the world's continued existence. He bled so that everyone else could eat. This is the bargain at the heart of Maya kingship, and you must hold it carefully in your mind, because everything that comes later will turn on it. The king's power and the king's burden were the same thing. He claimed to control the forces of nature, and the people believed him, which meant that as long as the rains came, as long as the corn grew, as long as the armies won, the king was a god walking among men, and the order he embodied was beyond question. But it also meant something else. Something quieter and far more dangerous, buried inside the bargain like a seed. It meant that if the rains ever failed, if the corn ever withered in the fields, and the reservoirs ever dropped low, and the children ever began to go hungry while the king bled and prayed and promised and nothing happened, then it would not just be a famine. It would be a failure of the king himself, a failure of the gods, a crack running straight through the foundation of the entire world. But that was unthinkable in the high, bright centuries when the cities were rising. The rains always came, the kings always bled, the corn always grew, and the holy lords climbed their painted pyramids in clouds of incense, with the whole valley watching from below, utterly certain that the order would hold forever. And they raised their stone monuments and stamped them with the exact day, and spoke across the centuries to a future they were sure would always be listening. Now let us watch that world reach its peak, and then let us watch the first, almost invisible cracks begin to spread. By the year 700 of the Common Era, the Maya world was not a single empire. This is one of the first things people get wrong about them, and it turns out to matter enormously for how they fell. There was no Maya emperor, no single capital, no central government ruling from a marble throne. Instead, picture something more like the world of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy, dozens upon dozens of independent city-states, each with its own holy lord, its own gods, its own dynasty stretching back through the generations, each one fiercely proud, fiercely competitive, and constantly maneuvering against its neighbors. They were bound together by a shared culture, a shared writing system, a shared calendar, shared gods, but they were rivals. And in the centuries of their greatness, that rivalry produced a kind of glittering, dangerous golden age, the way competition between rival cities so often does, right up until the moment it doesn't. At the height of all this stood two superpowers, locked in a struggle for dominance that ran for over a century and reshaped the entire region. To the north, the city the modern world calls Calakmul, its ancient emblem a coiled serpent, so we call its ruling line the Snake Kingdom. To the south, rising from the swamps of what is now the Petén jungle of Guatemala, the city of Tikal, with its great temples soaring above the forest canopy like stone mountains. These two cities hated each other in the patient, dynastic way that only true rivals can. They did not usually fight each other directly across the open distance between them. Instead, they fought a war of alliances and proxies and influence that stretched across hundreds of miles, pulling smaller kingdoms into their orbit, marrying their daughters into useful courts, installing friendly lords on neighboring thrones, and undermining each other through a constant, shifting web of betrayal and obligation. It was geopolitics of a startling sophistication, played out across the rainforest 1,000 years before anyone in Europe had heard of either city. And then, periodically, it erupted into open war. In the middle of the 6th century, the Snake Kingdom and its allies struck Tikal a blow so severe that the great southern city fell into a kind of darkness, a long stretch of more than 100 years during which it raised almost no monuments, recorded almost no dates, as if the proud city had simply gone quiet under the weight of its defeat. To a people who measured their very existence by the dates they carved, this silence was a kind of death. The Snake Kingdom had not just beaten Tikal on a battlefield, it had erased Tikal from time. But Tikal did not stay dead. More than a century later, a new king of Tikal, a man whose name comes down to us as Jessa Chan Ka'awil, rebuilt his city's strength in secret, gathered his allies, and, in the year 695, marched against the Snake Kingdom and broke it. He captured its sacred relics. He brought the war home. And he celebrated his victory by raising temples taller and grander than anything Tikal had ever built, stamping his triumph into the sky, where the rival city could see it and where, he was certain, the future would always remember it. This is the rhythm of the Maya Golden Age: war and triumph and monument. The taller temples of Tikal were not just buildings, they were arguments, carved in stone, about whose gods were stronger, whose blood was holier, whose king truly held the order of the universe in his hands. And in that competition, the cities pushed themselves to extraordinary heights. Consider the city of Palenque to the west, nestled against jungle-covered hills where waterfalls spilled cold and clear all year round. There, a ruler named Kanich Janab Pakal, Pakal the Great, came to the throne as a child and reigned for an almost impossible 68 years, an entire human lifetime of rule. Under him, Palenque became one of the most beautiful cities the Maya ever made, its buildings light and airy and elegant, decorated not with crude propaganda, but with delicate stucco portraits, flowing texts, art of a sensitivity that can still stop you in your tracks today. And when Pakal died, an old man after nearly 70 years of rule, his people did something extraordinary. They built him a tomb, deep inside a pyramid, and laid him in a great stone sarcophagus, his face covered in a mask of jade. and over him they set a carved lid that is one of the masterpieces of all human art, a swirling image of the dead king poised at the very mouth of the underworld, falling, or perhaps rising, along the trunk of the sacred world tree, suspended forever between death and rebirth. They sealed the tomb. They built the pyramid up around it. They expected him to lie there, undisturbed, watched over by his gods, for all of time. He lay there, undisturbed, for 1,300 years, until a Mexican archaeologist in the middle of the 20th century found a hidden staircase choked with rubble, cleared it stair by stair over 4 long seasons of digging, and finally broke through into the dark, to stand, alone, in the burial chamber of a god-king who had ruled before the fall of Rome was even cold in the memory of the world. The jade mask was still on the broken face. The lid was still in place. The certainty of Palenque had been kept, for a little while, exactly as its people had hoped. But Palenque itself did not last. None of them did. And to understand why, we have to look away, for a moment, from the kings and their temples and their wars, and look instead at the ground beneath their feet, and at the slow, invisible thing that was happening there while everyone was watching the sky. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about the Maya Golden Age. Every single thing that made it magnificent was also, quietly, making it fragile. Take the temples, those bright white pyramids gleaming across the jungle. They were coated in lime plaster, brilliant and beautiful, and absolutely essential to the look and feel of a Maya city. But to make lime plaster, you have to burn limestone. And to burn limestone, you need fire. Enormous amounts of fire. Some estimates suggest that producing the plaster for a single major building project could require burning the wood of acres upon acres of forest. Every new temple, every renovation, every fresh white coat on a plaza, each one ate the forest a little more. Now multiply that across dozens of competing cities, each one straining to build bigger and brighter than its rivals, each new holy lord eager to outdo his ancestors across centuries. The Maya were, without ever intending to, slowly burning down the forest that held their entire world together. And the forest was not just decoration. The forest was the engine of the rain. Rainforests, we now understand, help generate their own weather. The trees breathe moisture into the air. That moisture forms clouds. Those clouds return as rain. Strip away the trees and you do not just lose timber and shade. You can begin, subtly, to dry out the very sky above you. The Maya were chipping away at the natural machine that kept them alive, and they could not see it happening because it happened too slowly for any single generation to notice. It was the same story in the fields. As the cities grew, they needed more and more food, which meant clearing more and more forest for farmland. The exposed soil, no longer held in place by tree roots, began to wash off the hillsides in the heavy rains, sliding down into the valleys and the reservoirs and the swamps. The land grew thinner, tireder. A field that had once fed a family richly now gave a little less each year, and a little less, until the farmer had to clear yet more forest just to keep his children fed, which exposed more soil, which washed away more land, in a spiral that tightened so gradually that no one living inside it could feel the noose closing. And the people kept coming. This is the thing. In the high centuries, the Maya population did not just grow, it exploded. Some regions of the lowlands may have reached population densities comparable to the most crowded farming country in the world today. Cities and their surrounding farmlands sprawled until they nearly touched their neighbors, until the forests survived only in shrinking islands between the fields, until almost every acre of usable land was already being farmed by someone. A civilization that is using every scrap of its land, that has cut down most of its forests, that depends utterly on the rains coming exactly when expected, that is a civilization living without a margin, without a cushion, without anywhere to retreat to if something goes wrong. And the truly haunting thing is that none of it looked like decline, quite the opposite. The final century before the fall was, in many ways, the most spectacular of all. The monuments grew grander. The dates were carved with more flourish than ever. The kings waged their wars and bled for their gods and made their promises, and the cities glittered, and the population swelled. And to anyone standing in one of those bright plazas in the year 750, it must have seemed that the Maya had never been more powerful, more numerous, more certain of their place in the order of the universe. That is what a civilization looks like at the very top. It does not look like the beginning of the end. It looks like triumph. It looks like the future is endless. The cracks are there, in the eroding hillsides, in the shrinking forests, in the silent arithmetic of mouths and harvests. But they are quiet, and they are slow, and they are easy to ignore when the temples are gleaming, and the king is on his throne, and the rains, so far, have always come. So picture one more time that scribe in his cool palace room, brush in hand, in the bright noon of the Maya world. He has no idea. He is recording the triumphs of his king, the precise dates of victories, the names of captured rivals. He believes he is writing the early chapters of a story that will run for 1,000 more years. He is, in fact, writing very near the end. Because somewhere out beyond the cities, beyond the fields and the shrinking forests, in the vast indifferent machinery of the sky and the sea, something was beginning to shift. Slowly, invisibly. A change in the climate of the entire region that no Maya astronomer, however brilliant, could have predicted, and no holy lord, however much blood he offered, could have stopped. The rains were about to begin to fail, and a civilization that had built its entire existence on the certainty that the rain would always come, was about to discover the price of being wrong. Let us go up onto the pyramid, beside the king, and watch the sky. Let us watch for the clouds that are supposed to gather at the start of the wet season. Let us watch the whole valley turn its face upward, waiting, the way it has waited every year for 1,000 years. And let us watch what happens in the years when the clouds do not come. For a long time, this was the part of the story no one could explain. Scholars could see the cities empty. They could read the dates stop. They could stand in the silent plazas and feel the weight of the mystery. But the cause, the thing that finally tipped a thriving, brilliant, deeply rooted civilization over the edge, stayed maddeningly out of reach. People proposed everything: plague, invasion, peasant revolt, earthquake. Some even reached for the absurd, blaming everything from aliens to the wrath of forgotten gods. The truth, when it finally came, did not come from the ruins at all. It came from the bottom of a lake, and from the inside of a cave. This is one of those moments where the modern world reaches back across 1,000 years and touches the dead. And I want you to feel how strange and quiet and powerful it is. Because the Maya could not tell us what happened to them. Their books were burned. Their carvings simply stopped. But the rain itself kept a record. The water that fell, and the water that didn't, left traces in the natural world. And those traces waited, patiently, for someone clever enough to learn to read them. When rain falls on the Maya lowlands, some of it ends up in lakes, and over the centuries, those lakes lay down fine layers of sediment on their beds, year after year, like the pages of an enormous, slow book. In wet years, the chemistry of those layers looks one way. In dry years, when the lake shrinks and the water grows more concentrated, when certain minerals settle out that only settle in drought, it looks another way entirely. Scientists learn to drill down through those layers, pull up a long core of mud reaching thousands of years into the past, and read the climate of each century the way you might read tree rings. And what the mud said was this. Beginning around the year 800 and continuing in a series of brutal waves over the next century and more, the Maya world was struck by some of the most severe and prolonged droughts the region had seen in thousands of years. It was not a single dry summer. It was not even a single bad decade. It was a fundamental shift in the climate, a tightening of the rains across the entire heartland, with the worst of it landing precisely on the century when the great cities went dark. And then came the second witness. Deep inside a cave in what is now Belize, water had been dripping from the ceiling for thousands of years, each drop leaving behind a microscopic film of minerals that built up, layer on layer, into a stalagmite rising slowly from the cave floor. That stalagmite was a rain gauge running for millennia. In wet centuries it grew quickly, the minerals shifting in ways that recorded abundant rainfall. In dry centuries, its growth told a different and darker story. When scientists sliced it open and read it, year by year, it confirmed the mud's terrible testimony with eerie precision. The rains weakened just as the monuments stopped being raised. And the very worst, driest, most desperate stretch of all fell across the final, fatal decades of the Maya collapse. Two witnesses, the lake and the cave, both silent for 1,000 years, both finally telling the same story. The sky had closed. Now, I need you to slow down here, because it is very easy to hear there was a drought and to file it away as a simple, sad fact and move on. But that flattens the horror of it. So let me try to make you feel what this actually meant, not as a line on a graph, but as a thing happening to real human beings who could not see the graph, who had no idea what was happening to them or why. Imagine you are a farmer in one of those cities. Your family has farmed this same land for 20 generations. You know its moods. You know, in your bones, the rhythm of the year, the long, dry months when the land cracks and you wait, and then the gathering heat, and then the first clouds rolling in from the right direction, and then the rains, the blessed rains, that swell the corn and fill the reservoirs and turn the whole world green again. This rhythm is not just weather to you. It is the order of the universe. It is the gods keeping their promise. It is the proof, every single year of your life, that the world is working the way it is supposed to. And then one year, the clouds gather and break apart. The rain that comes is thin and late and not enough. The corn struggles. The harvest is poor, but you have stores, and you tighten your belt, and you tell yourself it was a bad year. There have always been bad years. The next year is worse. The reservoir, which should be brimming by now, sits low and brown. The stored corn is running thin. Your children's faces are getting that look you do not want to name. You go to the temple. You bring offerings. You watch the king climb the pyramid in his clouds of incense, and you watch him bleed for you, this holy Lord who controls the rain, and you believe, you have to believe, that he will fix it, that the gods are testing you, that the rains will return. The next year is worse still. Now there is real hunger. Now people are dying, not in a sudden plague, but quietly, in their homes. The very young and the very old first, the way famine always takes them. The reservoirs are not just low. The water that remains is going bad. We now have evidence, from the reservoirs of the great city of Tikal itself, that in its final stress decades the water became dangerously polluted, poisoned with toxic algae blooms that thrive in warm, stagnant, sun-baked water, and even contaminated with mercury, leached from the brightly colored mineral pigments the Maya loved to paint their world with, now washing down into the very tanks they drank from. The beautiful red of their temples, bleeding slowly into their water supply, their own splendor turning against them. So now picture the king, the holy Lord, the living door to the gods, whose whole claim to power, whose entire sacred bargain with his people, rests on his ability to keep the order of the world running, to bring the rain. And the rain will not come. He bleeds. He prays. He performs the great rituals exactly as his ancestors did, in front of a city that is starving, that is watching him, that has believed in him and his line for centuries. He raises a new monument, perhaps, with a new desperate prayer carved into it. He stares up at the same sky his astronomers have mapped so perfectly, and the sky stares back, empty, and gives him nothing. Imagine being that king. Imagine the private terror of it. You have spent your whole life believing what you have told your people, that you are the hinge between the worlds, that the gods listen to you, that your blood matters to the turning of the universe. And now, when it counts, when your people are dying in front of you, you discover the thing you can never say aloud, that you cannot do it, that the rain does not answer to you, that perhaps it never did, that perhaps the rains had simply always come on their own, year after year, and you and your ancestors had merely taken the credit, performed the rituals, and been proven right by sheer luck, century after century, until the luck ran out. This is the moment the whole structure begins to fail. Not just the harvests, the faith. Because the Maya kingship was not held up by armies or police or written law in the way we might imagine. It was held up by belief, by the deep, unquestioned conviction of hundreds of thousands of people that the Holy Lord truly was holy, that the order he embodied was real and necessary and beyond challenge. And belief is the strongest force in the world, right up until the moment it breaks. And then it is nothing at all. What do you do when the God King fails? When you have brought your offerings and tightened your belt and watched your children grow thin, and the man who promised to feed you cannot, and the gods he serves have gone silent, and the temples gleam as bright as ever above a city where people are beginning to die. At first, perhaps, you blame yourself. The offerings were not enough. The rituals were imperfect. You did not believe hard enough. This is what people do. It is easier to believe you have failed your God than to believe your God was never there. But the drought does not relent. It comes in waves, easing just enough to give hope, then closing in again, harder, for years. And slowly, across the whole Maya world, in city after city, the unthinkable thought begins to form in the minds of hundreds of thousands of desperate, hungry, frightened people. What if the king is not holy at all? What if the gods are not listening? What if the order we built our entire world on was never real? Hold that thought, because once that crack opens, once even a few people stop believing, everything that the belief was holding up begins to come down. The wars, the abandonment, the terrible final decades when the cities turned on themselves and then emptied into the jungle. It all flows from this single, silent catastrophe in the sky and in the human heart. The rain stopped, and a civilization discovered that everything it had been most certain of was a kind of beautiful illusion, propped up by a climate that had simply, for 1,000 fortunate years, decided to cooperate, and that owed them nothing, and that was about to take it all away. Now let us follow the cities down into the dark. Let us watch what people do in the years when the gods stop answering, and the corn will not grow, and the only thing left to fight over is whatever is left. When a world ends, it does not end all at once. That is one of the cruelest things about it. The end is not a single moment you can point to, a single day on which the lights go out. It is a slow unraveling, drawn out over decades, and the people living through it almost never understand that this is what is happening. They think they are living through a hard stretch, a bad few years, a crisis that will pass, the way crises always have. They are still planning, still hoping, still telling their children that things will get better. And in the Maya world, in the long, terrible century after the rains began to fail, the first thing that broke was not the cities themselves, it was the peace between them. Think about the logic of it. You have dozens of proud, hungry city-states packed close together, each one straining under drought, each one watching its harvests fail and its reservoirs drop and its people starve. And right next door is another city with its own fields, its own stored grain, its own reservoirs that might, just might, be a little fuller than yours. What happens? What always happens when desperate people run out of food and the thing standing between them and survival is the people next door. The wars that the Maya had once fought as a kind of ritualized contest between kings, a way to capture noble prisoners, to humiliate a rival, to prove whose gods were stronger, curdled, in the final century, into something uglier and more total. The evidence is written into the ground. Across the southern lowlands, in the very period the drought was tightening, we find a sharp rise in warfare, more burned buildings, more hastily defended cities, more bodies bearing the marks of violence. And nowhere is this final, desperate phase more vivid, more heartbreaking, more terrifyingly clear than in two cities deep in the Patexpatun region of what is now Guatemala, cities called Dos Pilas and Aguateca. Dos Pilas had been a powerful place, a city built on conquest and ambition. But as the world darkened, as enemies pressed in and resources vanished, its people did something that tells you everything about the terror of those final years. They tore their own city apart to save themselves. They pulled the stones out of their own temples and palaces, the sacred buildings, the homes of their kings and gods, and they used those stones to throw up crude defensive walls, ringing the city center, ringing even the most holy precincts in a desperate ring of fortification. Imagine the meaning of that. Imagine the despair it takes to dismantle the house of your God to build a wall around yourself. These were people who had spent centuries raising those temples to touch the sky, who had bled and starved and labored to make them perfect. And now, in the end, the temples were worth more as rubble in a barricade than as homes for gods who had stopped answering. The sacred had become merely useful. That, all by itself, is the sound of a worldview collapsing. It did not save them. Dos Pilas fell. Its people scattered, some of them fleeing to a sister city on a high defensible cliff above a lake, Aguateca, a natural fortress, a place you would choose if you were terrified and out of options and looking for somewhere the enemy could not easily reach. And it is at Aguateca that the archaeology becomes almost unbearable to read. Because Aguateca, too, fell. And it fell suddenly. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something that does not happen in cities that are calmly, peacefully abandoned. They found the city frozen in the middle of life. Grinding stones still sitting where they were used, with the work half done. Tools and pottery and precious objects left exactly where their owners had set them down. The unmistakable signature of people who did not pack up and leave in good order, but who fled, or were driven out, or were overwhelmed, so fast that they left everything behind. Somebody set down a grinding stone in the middle of grinding corn and never came back to pick it up. Just like that unfinished carving we began with, 1,000 years later, still waiting. The enemy burned the elite homes, the fine palaces went up in flames, and the city above the lake, the last refuge, the place that was supposed to be safe, went silent. This was happening, in its own way, across the whole southern lowlands. Not always with fire and slaughter. Often it was quieter than that, sadder than that, a slow leaking away rather than a violent death. But everywhere the same essential thing was unfolding. The great cities were emptying, and the clearest, most haunting record of it is the one the Maya themselves left us, without meaning to, simply by the way they stopped. Remember the long count. Remember the obsession with time, the dates carved into every monument, the unbroken chain of recorded days stretching back to the mythic moment of creation. For 7 centuries, the holy lords of the great cities had stamped the precise date onto their monuments, again and again, a steady heartbeat of recorded time pulsing across the whole Maya world. In the final century, that heartbeat begins to falter. You can map the collapse just by following the last dates. City after city carves its final monument, its final recorded day, and then, nothing. The chisels go quiet. In the western cities, the silence comes first. Palenque's last great date is carved, and then the beautiful city falls still. Then the central cities. The mighty Tikal, conqueror of the Snake Kingdom, raises its final dated monument, and then it, too, goes dark. One by one, like those lamps going out across the valley, the cities stop counting time. And then, at the very edge of it all, in a city called Tonina, on a date that falls in the year 909 in our calendar, someone carves what is, as far as we know, the very last long count date the Maya ever recorded in the old style, the last entry in a record that had run, unbroken, for nearly 800 years. After that, the great machine of recorded time simply stops. The civilization that had measured the heavens with breathtaking precision, that had spoken so confidently to the future, that had been so utterly certain that someone would always be there to read the date, that civilization carved its final day, and laid down the chisel. That is the unfinished carving we began with. That is the sentence no one ever completed. We have come all the way around to it now, and you can finally feel the full weight of what it means. It is not just one workman's interrupted task. It is the last gesture of a whole world that had run out of certainty, run out of faith, run out of reasons to believe that the future was still listening. But here's the question that still gnaws at the scholars, the question that turns this from a simple tragedy into a genuine mystery. Where did everyone go? Because, and this is crucial, for the most part, the people did not all die. There was death, terrible death, from famine and war and the collapse of everything that had kept them alive. The populations of these cities fell catastrophically. Some regions may have lost the overwhelming majority of their people over the course of a century. But the plazas are not filled with bones. The cities were not, for the most part, places of mass death. They were places of mass departure. The people left. They walked away. Slowly, over years and decades, family by family, they abandoned the great cities and dispersed, some moving to smaller villages, some heading toward regions where the water was more reliable, some drifting north, away from the worst of the dying heartland. The grand centralized world of the god-kings dissolved back into a scattering of smaller, humbler communities. The pyramids were left to the jungle, the palaces were left to the bats. The whole towering apparatus of holy lords and carved time and divine kingship, the thing we call Maya civilization at its peak, was set down and walked away from, like a tool that no longer worked. And maybe that is the most unsettling truth of all. The collapse of the Maya was not, in the end, just something that happened to them. In part, it was something they chose. Not in a single decision, but in 10,000 small ones, made by frightened, hungry, disillusioned people who looked at the dying cities and the failed kings and the silent gods, and made the only rational choice left to them. They stopped believing, and then they stopped showing up. Because think about what a city like that actually was. It was not held together by walls or armies. It was held together by a shared story, the story that the king was holy, that the gods were real, that the order was worth the staggering labor it cost to maintain. The farmers grew the food that fed the kings and priests and builders. The builders raised the temples that honored the gods. The scribes recorded the glory that justified the whole arrangement. It worked, for centuries, because everyone believed it was worth it, because everyone showed up and played their part. And the drought, the famine, the failed kings, the broken promises, what they really destroyed was the belief that any of it was worth it anymore. Why grow the surplus to feed a king who cannot make it rain? Why haul the stone to build a temple to a god who lets your children starve? Why stay in a dying, crowded, thirsty city, watching the powerful cling to a sacred order that has visibly failed when there is open land somewhere else and your family is hungry now? One by one, the people answered those questions with their feet. And once enough of them left, the whole thing was finished. The farmers stopped feeding the cities, so the cities could no longer support the kings. The kings, with no surplus to command, could no longer build, could no longer wage war, could no longer perform the grand rituals that justified their existence. The scribes had nothing left to record but the end. The story stopped making sense, and a city is only ever a story enough people agree to believe in. When they stopped believing, the city was already gone. The stones just hadn't noticed yet. So there was no single cause. That is the answer, after 2 centuries of searching, and it is both less dramatic and far more profound than people hoped. It was not the drought alone. Other droughts had come and gone before, and the Maya had survived them. It was the drought arriving at the precise moment when the civilization had stretched itself thinnest. Too many people, too little forest, too much exhausted soil, too many wars, too much faith resting on a promise that the rain could be controlled. It was a tower built impossibly high by brilliant people, and a wind that would have meant nothing to a lower tower, arriving at exactly the wrong moment to bring the whole magnificent, top-heavy thing crashing down. Pull away any one of those threads and perhaps it holds. A little more rain, a little more forest left standing, a little less war, a king a little more honest about the limits of his power, a people a little less certain that the order was eternal. Change any single one, and maybe the cities endure, and the carving continues, and the date that ends in the year 909 is just one more date among thousands more still to come. But the threads did not pull away. They held, all of them, all at once, in the worst possible combination, across one terrible century, and the most advanced civilization the Americas had ever produced came apart in the heat and the silence, and walked off into the jungle, and was forgotten. Or so the story usually goes. So the story has been told for 500 years, the tale of the lost civilization, the vanished people, the mysterious race that built the pyramids and then disappeared from the earth. But that story is wrong. And the truth it conceals is, in some ways, the most extraordinary part of all. Let me take you back to a detail I asked you to hold on to, near the very beginning. I told you that when European ships finally reached these shores, the newcomers would sail right past the great ruined cities and refuse to believe that the people living in their shadow had built them. I asked you to hold that detail because a cruel truth was hiding inside it. We have arrived, now, at that truth. And it is going to change the shape of everything you think you have just learned. Because the great collapse, the emptying of the southern cities, the silence of the long count, the abandonment of Tikal and Palenque and Copan, that was real. It happened. It was a catastrophe of staggering scale, one of the most complete collapses of any civilization in human history. But it was not the end of the Maya. Not even close. Here is the first thing the old story gets wrong. The collapse was not uniform. It did not strike the entire Maya world equally, or at the same time. It fell hardest on the southern lowlands, the deep interior rainforest of the Petén, the cities most dependent on rainfall and reservoirs, the most crowded, the most stretched, the most fragile. But to the north, on the flat limestone shelf of the Yucatan Peninsula, the story ran differently. And there, even as the southern cities were dying, something astonishing was happening. The north was rising. At the very time the southern heartland was emptying into the jungle, a great city in the northern Yucatan was reaching the height of its power, a city whose name you may already know, because its ruins are among the most visited in the world, Chichen Itza. While Tikal fell silent, Chichen Itza blazed. It built a new kind of monumental architecture, blending Maya traditions with influences flooding in from central Mexico. It raised the great stepped pyramid that millions of tourists photograph today, the temple we call El Castillo, built with such astonishing precision that twice a year, on the equinoxes, the afternoon sun throws a shadow down its northern staircase in the rippling shape of an enormous serpent descending from the sky, a feathered snake of light and shadow, alive for a single afternoon, engineered into the architecture by builders who understood the movements of the sun with breathtaking exactness. Does that sound like a vanished people? Does that sound like a civilization that disappeared from the earth? The Maya did not vanish. The center of gravity of their world shifted, north, away from the dying interior, toward the cenotes and trade routes of the Yucatan. And there, the story continued. Chichen Itza eventually faded too, in its own time and for its own reasons. But it was followed by another great power, the city of Mayapan, which rose to dominate much of the northern Maya world for more than 200 years, a walled city, a true political capital, ruling a confederation of lords right up until the 15th century, just a few generations before the Europeans arrived. So the timeline that most people carry in their heads, magnificent Maya cities, then a mysterious collapse, then nothing, is wrong. The reality is that Maya civilization rose, suffered an enormous regional collapse in the south, and then carried on, transformed, in the north for another 600 years. When the first Spanish ships appeared off the coast in the early 1500s, they did not encounter the ruins of a dead people. They encountered living Maya kingdoms, smaller and more fragmented than the old Golden Age, yes, but vibrant, populous, organized, fighting their own wars, trading across the sea, worshipping their own gods, and reading and writing in the same script their ancestors had used 1,000 years before. And this is where the deepest cruelty of the whole story begins. Because the Maya had survived the drought, they had survived the collapse of the kings, they had survived the abandonment of their greatest cities, they had reinvented themselves and endured for centuries. They had done the nearly impossible. They had outlived the fall of their own civilization. And then the ships came. What followed is one of the darkest passages in human history, and it deserves to be understood not as a footnote to the collapse, but as its terrible second act. The Europeans brought steel and horses and guns, and the Maya, divided into rival kingdoms, weakened, never unified, fought them with a ferocity that surprised the conquerors and slowed them for decades. The Yucatan was not easily taken. There was no single emperor to capture, no central throne to topple, no capital whose fall would end the war. Just kingdom after kingdom, town after town, each one resisting in its turn. The conquest of the Maya took not weeks, not months, but generations. But the Europeans brought something far deadlier than steel. They brought their diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, sicknesses that had circulated in the Old World for thousands of years, against which Europeans carried some inherited defense, and against which the peoples of the Americas had no defense at all. These plagues raced ahead of the conquerors, often arriving before the soldiers themselves, and they did what no army could have done. They killed in numbers almost beyond comprehension. Across the Americas as a whole, the great majority of the indigenous population, by many estimates well over 3/4 of it, died in the century after contact, most of them killed not by the sword, but by invisible diseases sweeping through communities that had never encountered them. Imagine surviving the drought, the famine, the collapse of your entire world. Surviving it as a people across 500 years, only for an invisible thing carried in on a foreign ship to burn through your villages and your children and leave you decimated. In your own homeland, watching strangers from across the sea take everything that remained. And then they came for the memory. This is the part of the story that I find, personally, the hardest to sit with. Because the conquest of the Maya was not only a conquest of bodies and land. It was a deliberate, conscious attempt to erase a mind, to burn out of the world an entire way of understanding it. The Maya, remember, were the great writers of the ancient Americas. They had their painted bark paper books, thousands of them, accumulated over centuries, holding their astronomy, their history, their calendars, their prophecies, the deep knowledge of a literate civilization. These books were the libraries of a people. They were the memory of 1,000 years. And a Spanish friar named Diego de Landa, charged with bringing the Maya to Christianity in the Yucatan, looked at those books and saw only the work of the devil. In the year 1562, in a town called Mani, he gathered up the Maya books and idols he could find, and he burned them. We do not know exactly how many he destroyed in that single act, but he burned the libraries of a civilization. By his own account, the Maya watched their books go into the flames with a grief that, even Landa admitted, caused them an anguish he had not expected. Think about that. Think about standing in that square, watching the accumulated knowledge of your ancestors, the painted record of 1,000 years of astronomy and history and poetry, the work of countless scribes in their cool palace rooms across the centuries, turned into ash in an afternoon, because a stranger from across the sea had decided your gods were demons and your knowledge was filth. Of the thousands upon thousands of Maya books that once existed, only 4 survive into our time. 4. Everything else, the vast library of one of the world's great literate civilizations, is simply gone, burned, rotted, lost. We will never read it. We will never know most of what they knew. The unfinished sentence on that limestone slab is only the smallest fraction of everything that was silenced. And here is the bitter, almost unbelievable twist. The same man who burned the books, Diego de Landa, later sat down and wrote an account of Maya life and customs, partly perhaps out of guilt, partly out of a colonizer's curiosity about the people he was helping to subdue. And in that account, trying to understand their writing, He asked a Maya informant to show him how their script worked, and he wrote down what he was told. He got it badly wrong. He thought the Maya symbols were a simple alphabet, like ours, when in truth, their writing was something far richer and more complex. His alphabet looked, for centuries, like a confused and useless mistake. But 400 years later, in the middle of the 20th century, scholars trying to crack the Maya script, to read the silent glyphs on the monuments, the writing that the descendants of the Maya themselves had lost the ability to read, picked up Landa's garbled, mistaken little alphabet and realized it was the key. Not an alphabet, but a record of how Maya symbols sounded. The thread that, once pulled, finally unraveled the whole magnificent script and let us hear, for the first time in centuries, the actual voices of the Maya kings, their names, their deeds, their boasts and prayers, carved in their own words. The man who burned their memory also, by accident, preserved the key to recovering it. History is rarely so cruel and so generous in the same breath. And still, the Maya endured. Even the conquest did not finish them. Deep in the rainforest, on an island in a lake in the heart of the old southern lowlands, a single Maya kingdom held out. The Itza people, who had withdrawn into the forest, maintained an independent city called Nopeten, free and unconquered, for nearly 200 years after the Spanish first arrived in the Americas. They watched empires rise and fall in the world beyond their lake. They were the last free Maya kingdom, the last independent flame of a civilization that had begun thousands of years before. It was not until the year 1697, long after the conquest of the Aztec, long after the conquest of the Inca, just a few generations before the founding of the country that would become the United States, that Spanish forces finally crossed the water and took Nopeten, extinguishing the last independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas. The very last ember of the ancient Maya political world, snuffed out at the close of the 17th century, 2,200 years after the first Maya cities had begun to rise from the swamps. That is how long they lasted. That is how hard they were to put out. And even then, even after Nopeten, the people did not vanish. They never did. They never have. Right now, as you listen to this, there are more than 6 million Maya people alive in the world. They live in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Belize, in Honduras. They speak around 30 distinct living Maya languages, direct descendants of the tongue once carved into those monuments. They farm the same lands. They keep the old calendar in their festivals and their ceremonies. Some of them live within sight of the ruined pyramids their ancestors built. The same pyramids that those first European visitors refused to believe could have been built by the people standing right in front of them. That was the cruelest myth of all. The idea that the Maya had vanished, that they were a lost or mysterious race, that someone else, anyone else, must have raised those temples. It was never true. It was a story the conquering world told itself, perhaps because it was easier to take a land from a people who were imagined to be already gone. The Maya were never lost. They were standing right there the whole time, holding the memory of a civilization that the wider world had decided, for its own convenience, to call dead. The cities fell, the kings fell, the books burned, but the people remained. And that changes the meaning of everything, including the meaning of that abandoned plaza, and that unfinished carving, and the long silence we began with. Because it was never really a silence. It was just that the rest of the world had stopped listening. I want to slow down now and take you inside the life and death of a single city, because the collapse as a whole can start to feel abstract. Droughts and dynasties and the rise and fall of regions, the kind of thing you watch from very high up. But no one ever lived the collapse from high up. They lived it on the ground, in one place, in one valley, watching one particular world end. And there is one city whose entire story, beginning to end, survives in such extraordinary detail that we can walk through it almost step by step. Its name is Copan. Copan sits at the far southeastern edge of the Maya world, in a green river valley in what is now Honduras. A fertile, beautiful place, watered by a real river, the kind of generous land the central cities could only dream of. And it was here, in the year 426, that a man arrived who would change the valley forever. We know his name because his descendants would carve it for the next 4 centuries. Kinich Yaks Cook Mo. The radiant first Quetzalcoatl. We are not entirely sure where he came from. The clues suggest he was an outsider, a lord who arrived from somewhere far to the west, perhaps carrying the prestige of the great central cities, perhaps even of distant central Mexico, with new gods and new ideas and a powerful claim to rule. He came into this valley and he founded a dynasty. And what makes Copan so precious to us is that this dynasty did not just rule. It recorded itself, obsessively, lovingly, completely, 16 kings in an unbroken line, each one carving his place in the story, each one adding to a monument to their own continuity that has no equal anywhere in the Maya world. There is a single carved altar at Copan, a square block of stone we call Altar Q, and on its 4 sides are carved 16 seated figures, 16 kings, the entire dynasty, from the founder to the last, portrayed in a ring, each one passing power to the next. And on the front, the founder, Kinich Yaks Kukmo, dead for 3.5 centuries by the time the altar was made, is shown handing the staff of office across all those generations to the 16th king, as if to say, across 350 years, you are still mine. You are still the continuation of what I began. The line is unbroken, and it will never break. It would break. The 16th king was nearly the last, but on the day that altar was carved, no one could imagine it. For most of those centuries, Copan flourished. It grew rich on the fertile valley and on trade. It produced some of the most spectacular sculpture in the entire Maya world. Figures carved nearly free of the stone, in a deep, rounded, 3-dimensional style that almost no other Maya city achieved. Its kings raised temples and ball courts and plazas, and they filled the city with carved portraits of themselves, gods, ancestors, the whole sacred drama of Maya kingship rendered in stone of astonishing beauty. And one of them, the 13th king, a great builder and patron of the arts, whose name we render as 18 Rabbit, pushed Copan to perhaps its highest point of artistic glory. Under him, the city blossomed. He raised monument after monument. He was, by every sign, a confident and powerful holy lord at the head of a thriving kingdom. And then, in the year 738, something happened that should have been impossible. Copan had a smaller neighbor downriver, a lesser city called Quirigua, long subordinate to mighty Copan, the kind of minor vassal a great king barely thinks about. And the lord of that small city captured 18 Rabbit. We do not know exactly how, perhaps in battle, perhaps through betrayal, but the great king of Copan, the artist king at the height of his power, was taken by his own vassal, and he was beheaded, sacrificed. The holy lord of one of the most magnificent cities in the Maya world, killed by an underling, his sacred body destroyed in a ritual of utter humiliation. Feel the shockwave of that. To the people of Copan, the king was not just a ruler. He was the hinge between worlds, the Holy One, the protected of the gods, and he had been captured and beheaded by a city that should not have been able to touch him. What does that do to a people's certainty? What does it do to the story they have believed for 300 years, that their kings are sacred, that their gods are strong, that the order will hold? A crack ran through Copan that day that would never fully close. The dynasty survived it. It even, for a while, seemed to recover. The 15th king, grandson of the murdered one, set out to restore the family's glory in the most ambitious way imaginable. He commissioned a staircase, but not just any staircase. He had built, rising up the face of a great temple, a flight of more than 60 stone steps, and onto the face of every single step he had carved the history of his entire dynasty. Thousands upon thousands of glyphs, the longest single hieroglyphic text the Maya ever produced, anywhere in their entire history. A monument that was, in essence, the autobiography of the royal line, written in stone for the gods and the future to read. A desperate, magnificent assertion that Copan was still great, still sacred, still eternal, no matter what had happened to 18 Rabbit. There is something unbearably poignant in that staircase. It is the act of a dynasty trying to write itself back into permanence at the very moment its permanence was beginning to fail. The more uncertain they became, the more grandly they carved. And there is a final irony. When archaeologists found the staircase, many of its stones had tumbled and scattered over the centuries, and they reassembled it as best they could. But they got the order of many of the steps wrong. So the longest Maya text in the world, the proud autobiography of the kings of Copan, now stands partly scrambled, its sentences out of sequence. A story we can read the words of but not fully follow. A broken record of a dynasty that broke. And then came the 16th king, Yat Pasa Chan Yopat, the last full ruler of Copan, the one shown on altar Q, receiving the staff from the founder across all those generations. He inherited a city already under strain, and not only from the political wound of 18 Rabbit's death. Something else was happening in the valley, something slower and more physical, and to see it, we have to look not at the monuments, but at the bones. Because at Copan, we can do something we cannot do in most ancient cities. We can study the actual remains of the people who lived and died there, across the generations, the kings, the nobles, and the ordinary farmers alike. And the bones tell a story that the proud monuments never would. They tell us that as Copan reached its peak, as the valley filled with people, the health of those people was quietly declining. We find more signs of malnutrition, more anemia, more of the marks that infectious disease and poor nutrition leave on growing bones, more dental damage from a diet that was getting worse. The bodies of the later population, even among the elite, show more stress, more sickness, more hunger than the bodies of their ancestors. The valley, in other words, was being eaten alive by its own success. Too many people. The hillsides cleared of forest for farmland, the exposed soil washing down into the valley floor, the good land thinning, the people pressing into the steeper, poorer slopes that should never have been farmed at all. The same quiet catastrophe we saw across the whole Maya world, playing out in miniature in one fertile valley, a population that had grown beyond what its land could sustain, slowly starving in the midst of its own splendor, generation by generation, while the kings carved ever grander monuments to a glory that the bones reveal was already rotting from beneath. And then the dynasty simply ran out. There may have been a 17th claimant to the throne, a man who tried, briefly, to take up the crown after Yak's passage. And it is to that final, desperate moment that we owe one of the most haunting objects in the entire Maya world. He commissioned an altar, we call it Altar L, meant like Altar Q before it, to show him receiving power and continuing the sacred line. He never finished it. One side of Altar L is carved beautifully, in the old style, the figures emerging from the stone, the way Copan sculptors had always made them emerge. And the other sides are blank, or barely begun, sketched out, the first cuts made, and then abandoned, the chisel set down, the work stopped. The dynasty of 16 kings, the unbroken line stretching back 3.5 centuries to the radiant Macaw, who came into the valley and founded a world, ended not with a conquest or a massacre, but with an unfinished carving. A monument to a continuity that could no longer continue. A sentence in stone that no one ever completed. We began this whole journey with an unfinished carving in the jungle. Now you know that it was not one stone in one place. It was the signature of the entire collapse. Across the Maya world, the last act of city after city was a thing left half-made. A date never completed, an altar never finished, a grinding stone set down mid-task, a staircase scattered out of order. A civilization that had spent 1,000 years finishing things with breathtaking care, ending, everywhere, in the middle of a stroke. And here is the part that haunts me most about Copan. The dynasty ended, but the valley did not empty all at once. people lingered. For decades after the last king, ordinary families went on living in and around the ruins of the royal city, farming, surviving, occupying the crumbling palaces of kings who no longer ruled. We can see it in the archaeology. Humble dwellings built right into the abandoned grandeur, cook fires lit in throne rooms, the great sacred buildings reduced to shelter. The people did not flee the king's fall. They outlived it. They simply went on, smaller and poorer and uncrowned, in the shadow of a glory they could no longer maintain, and could probably no longer even fully explain to their children. Imagine being one of those children, growing up in the wreckage of Copan a generation after the last king, playing among carved monuments your family can no longer read, beneath temples no one will ever build again, hearing the old people speak of a time when this place was the center of the world, and holy lords climbed those crumbling stairs in clouds of incense, and not quite believing it, because all you have ever known is the ruin. The greatness has already passed into legend, even for the people still living right on top of it. And then, over the years, even they drift away. The fires go cold. The last family leaves the valley. The river goes on running, indifferent, past the empty city. And the forest, patient as ever, begins to come down off the cleared hillsides and reclaim the plazas, sending its roots down into the great staircase and the altars and the carved faces of all 16 kings, prying the dynasty apart, one slow millimeter at a time, until there is no one left in the whole green valley who remembers that any of it ever happened. That is how a world ends. Not with a single catastrophe, but like this. One valley, one dynasty, one unfinished altar, one last family banking a fire in the ruin of a king's palace, and then walking away. Multiply it across 100 cities, and you have the fall of the Maya. Not a single great death, but 100,000 small endings, each one a whole world to the people living through it, each one swallowed in the end by the green and the silence and the patient, waiting trees. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean, this 1,000-year-old story of a brilliant people who built a world and lost it and survived it, and were nearly erased and are still, against everything, here? Why does it reach across all those centuries and take hold of us? Why does that unfinished carving still have the power to make us go quiet? I think it is because, somewhere beneath the surface, we recognize it. I think it is because their story is, in the end, also a question about us. For a long time, the fall of the Maya was studied the way you might study a beautiful, distant tragedy, something safely sealed in the deep past, a cautionary tale about a vanished people in a far-off jungle, with no real bearing on the lives of those of us reading about it from our cities of glass and steel. A story to shiver at and then close the book on. We do not have that luxury anymore, because the more carefully scholars piece together what actually happened to the Maya, the more uncomfortably familiar it began to look. Strip away the jade and the pyramids and the painted bark paper books, and look at the bare machinery of the collapse, and you find a sequence of events that should make anyone living in the 21st century sit very still. A civilization grows brilliantly for centuries. It becomes more populous, more sophisticated, more interconnected, more confident than any that came before it. It pushes its environment harder and harder to feed that growth, clearing its forests, exhausting its soils, drawing down its water, consuming the natural systems that quietly keep it alive, all without ever quite noticing, because each generation only sees its own small slice of the slow decline. It comes to depend, utterly, on a stable climate continuing to behave the way it always has. And it builds, on top of all this, a towering structure of belief and power and complexity that can only stand as long as everything keeps working exactly as expected. And then the climate shifts, not because of anything any single person did, but as the cumulative result of forces too large and too slow for any one human life to perceive. And the towering structure, with no margin left, no forest to fall back on, no soil in reserve, No slack anywhere in the system, no faith left to bind it together once the promises start failing. The towering structure comes down. I do not think I need to draw the parallel too sharply. You can feel it already. The Maya did not have satellites. They did not have ice cores or climate models or the accumulated science of the whole human species at their fingertips. They could not see what was happening to them. When the rains began to fail, they had no way of understanding why, no framework for grasping that they had spent centuries weakening the very forests that generated their weather, no concept of the larger climatic forces tightening around their world. They experienced the catastrophe as a religious crisis, as the gods falling silent, because that was the only language they had for it. They responded with more rituals, more blood, more desperate construction, more war over the dwindling remains, because those were the only tools they understood. We are not in their position. That is the thing I keep coming back to. We can see. We have the satellites and the ice cores and the models. We can read the warnings written in the lake mud and the cave stone, not just of the Maya's collapse, but of the changes accelerating in our own atmosphere right now. We have the one thing the Maya never had, the ability to understand what is happening to us while there is still time to do something about it. And that, strangely, makes their story more frightening rather than less. Because it raises a question the Maya never had to face, and it points it directly at us. What good is seeing the iceberg if you decide the warning can wait? The Maya farmer who watched the rains fail and brought more offerings to the temple was not a fool. He was doing the most rational thing available to him within the story he had been given. He believed the king could bring the rain, so he supported the king. He believed the gods were testing him, so he tried harder to please them. His tragedy was not stupidity. His tragedy was that he was trapped inside a way of understanding the world that could not grasp the real nature of the threat until it was far too late. We are not trapped that way. We understand the real nature of our threats with a precision the Maya could not have dreamed of. And yet, and this is the part that should keep us up at night, understanding is not the same as acting. We can know, with the full force of the world's accumulated science, exactly what is coming, and still find 10,000 reasons to set the warning politely aside, to insist that things will surely continue as they always have, to trust that our towering structure is simply too big, too advanced, too unsinkable to ever come down, to feel in our chests that simple, unquestioned certainty that nothing bad could happen here. The Maya felt that certainty too, right up until the moment the water stopped coming. And there is a deeper lesson hiding even beneath that one, something about the nature of certainty itself, something the Maya story whispers across the centuries to anyone willing to hear it. The Maya did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were strong. They fell because their civilization was so successful, so sophisticated, so dominant for so long, that it became impossible for anyone inside it to imagine that it could ever end. The very success was the trap. The very confidence was the iceberg. The unbroken 1,000-year record of the rains arriving on time was not reassurance. It was the slow accumulation of a debt that would all come due at once, in the single century when the luck finally ran out. This is the thing about the fall of any great civilization that is so hard to hold in the mind. It does not feel like falling from the inside until it is nearly over. It feels like the peak. It feels like the golden age. The monuments are grandest, the confidence highest, the certainty most complete in the years just before the end. The people carving those last beautiful glyphs were not living in a visibly dying world. They were living in what felt like the height of human achievement, and that feeling was precisely the illusion that prevented them from seeing the cracks until the cracks had become a collapse. Every civilization that has ever fallen believed, right up until it fell, that it was the exception, that the rules of rise and decline that governed all the others somehow did not apply to it. The Maya believed it. Rome believed it. Every great power in history has believed it. And every single one of them has been wrong, eventually, in its turn. There is a particular kind of silence in those abandoned plazas that I have been trying this whole time to make you hear. It is not the silence of a people who were stupid or weak or doomed from the start. It is the silence of a people who were, in their day, the most brilliant and accomplished and certain in their entire hemisphere, and who could not, in the end, see the shape of what they were living through until it was already too late to stop it. It is the silence of confidence after the thing it was so confident about has quietly come apart. And the most haunting question of all is the one we can never answer. Was there a moment, somewhere in that long century of decline, in one of those dying cities, was there a person, a king, a priest, a farmer, a scribe, who saw it clearly, who understood before the others that the world was not merely passing through a hard stretch, but was actually ending, who tried to say so and was not believed because what they were saying was unthinkable, because the certainty was too strong, because no one wanted to hear that the gods were not coming and the rains were not returning, and the only thing left to do was to gather the children and walk away from everything their ancestors had built. We will never know. That voice, if it existed, is part of the silence now. It is one of the things that burned, or rotted, or was simply never written down. But I find I cannot stop imagining it. The one who saw. The one who understood, and could not make the others understand, and had to watch the world end anyway, carrying the unbearable knowledge alone. Because that too is part of what their story asks of us. Not only will we see the warning, but if we do see it, if we are the ones who understand, will anyone listen? Or will we simply be a voice in our own dying plaza, watching the certain ones perform their certain rituals, knowing what is coming, unable to make ourselves heard above the noise of a civilization absolutely sure that it is the exception? The Maya cannot answer that for us. They can only stand there, in the ruins, in the silence, holding up their unfinished sentence, and let us decide for ourselves what to make of it. Let me tell you what it is actually like to stand there. Because I have been speaking in grand terms, civilizations, climates, the rise and fall of worlds, and there is a danger in that. The danger is that it stays abstract, that the Maya remain a lesson, a parable, a chess problem in collapse. And they were not a lesson. They were people. So let me bring you all the way back down to the ground one last time and put you in the ruins as they are now, so that you can feel the full strangeness of what survives. The cities are still there. That is the first thing to understand. They were never destroyed in the way we usually mean. They were abandoned, and then they were swallowed. But the bones of them remain. The pyramids, the plazas, the palaces, the carved monuments, all of it still standing or fallen but present beneath 1,000 years of jungle. For centuries they lay almost entirely hidden, known only to the Maya who still lived among them, and to the occasional traveler who stumbled into a clearing and looked up, astonished, at a mountain of worked stone rising out of the trees. And when explorers finally began to map them in the 1800s, the experience of finding them was unlike anything else in the history of discovery. Imagine hacking through dense rainforest, the air thick and green and loud with insects, and coming upon a wall. A worked stone wall in the middle of nowhere, with no living memory attached to it. And then another, and then a staircase. And then, as you clear the vines away, a carved human face staring back at you out of the stone. A king, dead 1,000 years, his name unknown, his story unreadable, his city utterly empty. The whole vast complex of temples and courtyards and monuments standing in perfect silence beneath the canopy, with no one to tell you what any of it had been. The early explorers described the feeling again and again, and it is always the same feeling: awe and unease and a kind of vertigo. Because a ruined city in your own civilization is sad, but it is comprehensible. You know who built it and why it fell. A ruined city built by a people the world had decided were lost, covered in a writing no living person could read, abandoned for reasons no one could explain. That is something stranger. That is standing in the presence of an entire universe of meaning that has gone dark. Every one of those thousands of glyphs meant something. Every carving was made by someone, for someone, to say something specific and important. And all of it had been silenced so completely that, for 100 years, the most learned people in the world could only stand before it and guess. It took until our own era to begin to read it. The breaking of the Maya script, the long, brilliant, contentious effort by scholars across the 20th century to make those silent glyphs speak again, is one of the great intellectual adventures in the history of the human mind. And what they found, when the writing finally began to yield, transformed everything. For a long time, scholars had imagined the Maya as a gentle, peaceful people of stargazing priests, obsessed with time and astronomy, floating serenely above the messy human business of war and politics. The carvings, once read, shattered that fantasy. The glyphs were not abstract meditations on the cosmos. They were intensely, vividly human. They were history. They were the names of real kings and queens, their birthdays and their accession dates, the names of their parents and their children. They were records of wars. This king captured that lord on this date and sacrificed him on that one. They were boasts and propaganda and dynastic claims and bitter rivalries. They were a queen who ruled in her own right, a child king crowned at the age of 5, a lord who reigned for 68 years, a vassal who beheaded his overlord. They were, in other words, exactly as full of ambition and pride and cruelty and love and fear as any human history has ever been. And that is when the Maya stopped being a mystery and started being people, real people, with names, who lived and schemed and triumphed and suffered and died in those silent cities, who left us their own words, carved in their own stone, and who waited 1,000 years for someone to learn, at last, how to listen. But we will only ever hear a fraction of them. That is the wound that never closes. Because for every monument that survived, there were thousands of books that did not. Remember the 4. Out of an entire literature, an entire library accumulated over 1,000 years, 4 books survived the burning and the rot and the conquest. 4. And those 4 are mostly almanacs and astronomical tables, the technical manuals of the priesthood, the histories, the poetry, the stories, the myths in their own full telling, the philosophy, the songs, the accumulated wisdom and imagination of one of humanity's great civilizations. Almost all of it is simply gone. Ash and dust and silence. Think about what that means. Think about how much of who we are is carried in our books, our stories, our recorded thoughts. Imagine a future in which everything humanity ever wrote was destroyed, except for 4 technical manuals, a tide table, an astronomical chart, a couple of ritual calendars, and that this was all that any future people would ever have of us. They would know we existed. They would know we were sophisticated. They would be able to reconstruct fragments of what we knew. But they would never read our novels, never hear our songs, never know our jokes or our prayers or the stories we told our children. They would have the skeleton of us and almost none of the soul. That is what we have of the Maya. The skeleton, recovered painstakingly from the stone, and from those 4 surviving books, and from the lake mud and the cave stone and the bones in the ground. We have learned to read the names of their kings. We will never read most of what was in their hearts. The conquest did not only kill the Maya of its own time. It reached back and murdered the memory of every Maya who had ever lived, erased 1,000 years of human imagination in a single afternoon's fire, and several decades worth of rot and neglect besides. The unfinished sentence on that limestone slab is, in a way, the only kind of sentence we will ever have. Broken, incomplete. A fragment of something we can sense was once whole and beautiful, and is now beyond our reach forever.
And yet,
the story does not end in that fire, and I will not let us leave it there. Because to leave it there would be to repeat the oldest lie about the Maya, the lie that they are gone. Go to those highland towns in Guatemala today, and you will hear languages spoken in the markets that are the living descendants of the tongue carved into Copan's monuments. Go to the festivals, and you will see ceremonies that carry threads of the old calendar, the old reverence for the cycles of time, woven now through centuries of survival and adaptation and faith. The Maya kept what could be kept. They lost the kings and the cities and the books and the script, and they kept themselves. They kept their languages, their connection to the land, their identity as a people, through a colonial conquest that tried to erase all of it, through 5 centuries of pressure that would have dissolved a weaker people entirely. There is a generation of young Maya now, scholars and activists and ordinary people, who are doing something their ancestors could not have imagined. They are learning to read the glyphs again. The writing that was lost, that even the Maya themselves could no longer read after the conquest broke the chain of transmission, is being recovered, taught, reclaimed by the descendants of the very people who wrote it. There are Maya people today who can stand before the monument of an ancestor dead 1,200 years and read his name aloud, in a Maya language, the way it was meant to be read. The voice that was silenced is being given back to the people it was taken from. I find that almost unbearably moving. After everything, the drought, the collapse, the conquest, the plagues, the fire that took the books, the Maya are reaching back across the silence and recovering the voices of their own dead. The unfinished sentence cannot be finished, but it can be read. The descendants of the scribe in his cool palace room are learning, once again, to understand the marks his hand made on the stone. The chain that was broken is being, strand by strand, retied. So, when we talk about the fall of the Maya, we have to hold 2 truths at once, and never let go of either. The fall was real. It was vast. It was one of the most complete collapses any civilization has ever suffered, and it carried away almost everything. The kings, the cities, the books, the certainty. A way of understanding the universe that took 1,000 years to build and will never fully be recovered. And the people endured. They are here. They were always here. The fall was not the end of the Maya. It was only the end of one version of their world, the most spectacular version, the version of god-kings and towering pyramids and carved eternal time. And even that ending was not a death, but a transformation, a survival into a quieter and humbler form, carrying forward the one thing that truly mattered, which was never the stone at all. The stone was only ever the part that lasts, the part that the jungle swallows slowly enough for us to find. The people were the civilization, and the people went on. Which leaves us, at the end of all of it, back where we began, in the abandoned plaza, with the howler monkeys crying in the dark, and the roots cracking the temples open 1 slow millimeter at a time. But now you see it differently. Now you know that the silence was never empty. Now you know whose unfinished sentence that was, and why it stopped, and what it cost, and what survived. Now, when you stand in that plaza, you are not standing in the grave of a mystery. You are standing in the long pause of a story that is still, against everything, being told. It is worth sitting, at the very end, with how long all of this took. We move through history so quickly when we tell it. A civilization rises in a sentence, falls in a paragraph, is rediscovered in a line. But none of it was quick. The first Maya villages took root by swamps and rivers more than 3,000 years ago. The golden age of the great cities lasted not for a few generations, but for the better part of a millennium, longer than the span between the fall of Rome and the present day. The collapse itself unspooled across 100 years and more, slow enough that a person could be born into a thriving city and die in a dying one without ever feeling the world turn beneath them. And the survival afterward, the long, quiet endurance, the conquest, the recovery, That is another 500 years, running right up to the people alive today. We are talking about a story so vast that no single human life could ever contain more than a sliver of it. The scribe in his palace room lived his whole life inside the Golden Age and died believing it was eternal. The farmer who watched the first droughts come lived his whole life inside the slow beginning of the end and never knew it had a name. The child in the ruins of Copan lived inside the aftermath and thought the greatness was a fairy tale. Each of them saw only their own fragment. Only we, standing at the far end of 3,000 years, can see the whole arc, the rise, the peak, the fall, the silence, the endurance, laid out at last like a single great sentence, finally complete. And maybe that is the strangest gift the Maya leave us. The ability to see a whole civilization's life from beginning to end, the way we can never see our own. We are inside our story. We have no idea which chapter we are in. We do not know if we are the Golden Age, or the first dry year, or the unfinished carving. We cannot see the shape of our own arc, any more than the scribe could see his. That is the condition of being alive inside history. You only ever get your fragment, and you have to decide what to do with it without ever knowing how the story ends. The Maya did not get to choose their ending. The drought came, and the wars came, and the ships came, and the fire came, and most of what they were is lost to us forever. But there is one thing they did get to leave behind, and it is the only thing that ever really lasts. Not the pyramids. The jungle is still taking those, slowly, and one day they will be gone. Not even the stone. What they left is the thing you are feeling right now. The reach of one human moment across an impossible gulf of time. A person set down a chisel 1,200 years ago, mid-stroke, in a dying city, and across all those centuries that simple, unfinished gesture has reached you and made you go still, and made you wonder, and made you care about people you will never meet, whose names you will never know, whose world ended longer ago than you can truly imagine. That is not nothing. That might be everything. That might be the only kind of immortality any of us ever actually gets. Not the monument which crumbles, not the empire which falls, but the quiet reach of one human moment touching another across the dark. The proof that we were here, that we built and dreamed and feared and hoped, that we mattered to ourselves even in a universe that gave us no reason to believe we mattered to it at all. The Maya measured time more carefully than almost anyone in human history. They were obsessed with it. They carved its precise coordinates into stone so the future would know exactly when they stood there. And in the end, time did to them what it does to everything. It took the cities, the kings, the books, the certainty, and it folded them all back into the green and the silence. But it could not take the one thing they were really trying to say with all those carved dates, the thing beneath the obsession, the thing that drove a scribe to record the exact day so that someone, someday, would read it. They were trying to say, we were here. And across 1,200 years of silence, against the drought and the fire and the patient, swallowing jungle, the message arrived. We heard it. We are hearing it right now. The plaza is empty. The howler monkeys are calling in the dark the way they have for 1,000 years, the way they will for 1,000 more. The roots are still working their way into the stone, one slow millimeter at a time, and one distant day there will be nothing left of the great cities at all. Nothing but the story, and the people who carry it, and the sentence that was never finished, still waiting in the green for a hand that is never coming back. But it was finished in a way. Not in stone. In us. The scribe could not complete a sentence. We completed it for him, simply by caring enough to learn how it began. The kings are gone. The gods fell silent. The books are ash. The certainty that built the towering, top-heavy, magnificent world of the Maya proved to be the very thing that brought it down. And the only wisdom we can carry up out of those abandoned plazas is the willingness to be a little less certain ourselves, to remember that the world is older and larger and stranger than our confidence in it, and that it does not care, in the slightest, how sure we are that our own bright cities will stand forever. The Maya were so sure. And then the rain stopped coming, and the certainty that felt exactly like wisdom turned out to be the iceberg all along. They were here. For 3,000 years they were here, and for a few magnificent centuries, they were among the most brilliant people the world had ever produced. And then the long, slow ending came, and most of what they were passed into silence. But not all of it, never all of it, because they are here still, 6 million strong, speaking the old languages, reading the old stones, carrying the memory forward into a future their god kings could never have imagined. Remember them. Remember the scribe, and the farmer, and the child in the ruins, and the holy Lord who bled for a rain that would not come. Remember that they were not a lesson or a mystery or a vanished race, but people, as real and frightened and hopeful as we are, who built something extraordinary and lost it and endured. Remember that none of it had to happen the way it did, and that all of it did, and that the only thing we can carry up out of that long silence is the willingness to look honestly at our own bright, certain, towering world, and to ask, while there is still time to ask it, whether we are reading the warnings or setting them politely aside. The jungle has the last word now, in the empty plazas. It always did. And this, the god kings and the carved eternal time, the drought and the fire and the 4 surviving books, the 250,000 who walked away into the green, and the 6 million who carry the story still, this was one of history's last chapters.